Why did Russia retreat from Kherson? On Friday, November 11th, the Russian Military of Defense reported that the redeployment, yes, Russia claims it is a planned regrouping of troops, not a retreat, from Kherson to the left bank of the Dnieper, was completed by 5 a.m. Thus, the Russian army left Ukraine's only regional center that it managed to capture after February 24th. Moscow claims that more than 30,000 servicemen have been withdrawn to the left bank of the Dnieper River. The Russian Defense Ministry also stated that during the withdrawal, not a single piece of military equipment and weaponry was left on the right bank. All Russian servicemen crossed the river. No losses of personnel, armament, equipment, and other material means of the Russian grouping were allowed. Is this the case? Let us investigate what losses Russia suffered and why they retreated. They said that Kherson was a Russian city, and it was with them forever. The reasons are the same as I described in the last video. Due to Ukrainian strikes or Russian supply routes, Russia cannot maintain its forces on the right bank of the Dnieper. Now, after taking Kherson, the Ukrainian army is now reaching the north of Crimea with missiles, where they are already creating military fortifications in preparation for defense. Rocket attacks are now taking place practically all along the left bank. The Ukrainian military also systematically continues to hit ammunition depots, military airfields, and other important facilities. After the commander of the combined group of troops in Ukraine, Sergei Surovikin, reported to Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, the general suggested taking up defenses on the Dnieper's left bank and said it was futile to keep a group of troops on the right bank. Shoigu agreed and ordered the redeployment of troops, but in fact, Russia had begun withdrawing heavy equipment weeks before from Kherson. A retreat is one of the most difficult maneuvers in warfare. Such an operation requires good organization and preparation of the troops, and it must be planned. Otherwise, a retreat can easily turn into a chaotic escape, with the loss of manpower and equipment, the worst thing that can only await any army, as demonstrated by the Russian army in the Kharkiv region. Here they decided to prepare. In Ukraine, after the official announcement of the start of the retreat, many thought that the withdrawal of the Russian troops to the left bank might well be a hoax to lure the Ukrainian military, but later they saw signs that it was a retreat after all, which the Russian army was trying to make in as organized a manner as possible. But it did not work in the most organized way possible, because the Ukrainian army launched artillery and missile strikes against the retreating troops. This included a small number of bridges, ferry crossings, improvised watercraft, etc. So there were losses, perhaps small, but there were losses. It's the same with Russian military equipment. There are many videos on the internet of abandoned military equipment in Kherson, and one Russian soldier posted a video in which he says he received orders to change into civilian uniforms and flee. And as the residents of Kherson themselves report, they saw many disguised Russian soldiers in civilian uniforms. Before the retreat, the Russian army mined a lot of areas on the right bank, which the Ukrainian military will have a long time to clear. According to the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, as of November 25th, more than 5,000 explosive objects have already been deactivated in the Kherson region. The Russians mined the buildings of Ukrainian law enforcers. In particular, almost all the offices in the Security Service of Ukraine building were mined. The authorities said that they would most likely blow it up due to the impossibility of fully clearing it. So from this, we can conclude that the Russian military was preparing for a retreat, withdrawing military equipment in advance, and mining the area instead of retreating from the Kharkiv region, where they simply fled. Now, the nature of warfare in Ukraine has changed dramatically with the onset of rainy and cold weather. Conducting war in the fields is virtually impossible. There is a tactical pause in the war. Both sides are accumulating forces. Ukraine is waiting for weapons and uniforms from Western partners, while Russia is replenishing its army with mobilized soldiers. However, winter is ahead, which will change the nature of the war even more. Both armies will now be required to have different fighting and survival skills. The question is, will the Ukrainian military or the Russian army be able to advance, or will the adversaries accumulate forces for active action in the spring? Although most of Ukraine has a temperate climate, there are severe frosts and snow during the winter, especially in the east and northeast of the country. The main difference in winter warfare is that soldiers on the front lines are required not only to have certain tactical skills, but also to be able to survive in freezing temperatures. The same applies to weapons, clothing, equipment, machinery, and everything else that matters in war. They too must be appropriate to the season. Frost, snow, and wind can kill as well as a bullet or shrapnel. Military uniforms become a much more important part of the supply in winter than they do in summer. And it's not just about its quality. It's clear that in winter clothes should be warm, otherwise a person will just freeze. Also important is the quantity. Low temperatures can cause death, for example in the case of wounds, While in summer, a wounded person can stay on the battlefield after bandaging and wait for darkness, in winter, a few hours without movement on the ground can be fatal. In the winter, the frontline life is filled with new items: chemical heaters, electric and conventional stoves, generators, special grease for weapons, chains for wheels, and more. All these things must be delivered. The mobilized, with which Russian army is trying to fill the shortage of personnel on the front lines, judging by the numerous video messages recorded by them and their relatives, are often forced to buy clothing and even protective equipment at their own expense. Among them are probably those who are fond of winter fishing and know which boots, pants, and jackets keep warm better and get less wet. But many may buy warm clothes that are suitable for walks in the park, but will not be useful in a trench. As for the Ukrainian army, warm clothing and other winter gear began to appear on lists of Western supplies to Ukraine in early fall. In September, Belgium announced such supplies, and in early October, Canada announced that it would supply Ukraine with 400,000 pieces of various winter clothing items. Tens of thousands of winter jackets, pants, and hats were also promised by Germany. 35,000 sets of winter uniforms were supplied by Lithuania, and 25,000 by Great Britain. Blankets and warm clothing were also supplied by Israel and Finland. Supplies of warm winter clothing to Ukraine were also reported at the Pentagon briefing. It is not known exactly how many sets of winter uniforms were supplied to Ukraine by Western partners, but it is known that the Ukrainian army will be much better prepared for winter warfare conditions. As for winter supplies, in winter, supplying itself becomes a much more difficult task. Although frozen ground is easier to move than wet ground in the spring and fall, snowfall, even a small layer of it, severely limits the ability to move over rough terrain. The thesis, "The war is waged on the roads," is particularly accurate in winter. The roads themselves also have become less passable. Snowfall and ice after freezing temperatures require additional road capacity efforts. If a truck breaks down a little in the summer, it can be repaired on the side of the road. In freezing weather, it's much more difficult to do so. Any breakdown becomes a problem not only for those who have to evacuate and repair malfunctioning or damaged equipment, but also for supply companies who have to deliver spare parts to the front shops. In general, whoever is better supplied for winter conditions will have the advantage on the battlefield. One thing is certain: Ukraine will not stop there and will continue to advance and reclaim its territories. Where and when this will take place is still difficult to say. In a strategic sense, the most attractive and tempting for the Ukrainian military would be an offensive from Zaporizhzhia to Melitopol to cut the land corridor to Crimea. The success of such an offensive would dramatically complicate the position of the Russian grouping in Crimea and on the left bank of the Kherson region, primarily in terms of logistics. However, the Russian military is also aware of this possibility, and therefore, the Russian command is deploying forces to the Zaporizhzhia direction and preparing new defense lines there, including fortifications. Therefore, this scenario is unlikely. Given the way Ukraine fights, it is more likely to strike where the enemy does not expect it. Separately, I would like to say that while there is a tactical pause on the battlefield, Russia continues to shell civilian and energy facilities in Ukraine. By doing so, it wants to force Ukraine to sit down at the negotiating table, although Russia itself claims that it only strikes military targets. Putin needs negotiations because he understands that he is losing on the battlefield. He needs to pause. But Ukraine will not go for this because it understands that eventually, the Russian military attacks will begin again after a pause. The president of Ukraine claimed clear conditions for negotiations with Russia, the main of which were withdrawal of the Russian military from Ukraine, including Crimea, compensation for the damages caused by war, the punishment of all war criminals. Putin does not agree to these conditions and tries to force a conversation on his terms. He understands that he has lost this war, but he tries to hold on to his power by any means, terrorizing Ukraine with Iranian drones or missiles. But thanks to Western partners, the problem with drones has practically been solved, and they will also solve the problem with missiles, closing the sky with air defense. And Russia does not have many missiles left, so it wanted to buy missiles from the same Iran that supplied them with drones. But it was made quite clear to Iran that by making these supplies, it would be under very significant sanctions pressure. After the U.S. warning, Tehran suspended the deal to supply Russia with Fateh 110 and Zulfiqar missiles. Selling Iranian medium-range missiles to Russia would significantly change the strategic balance of power in the region, and such a scenario is a major concern for the United States and its allies. To prevent such a scenario, the U.S. will exert maximum pressure on Iran, and it will most likely not dare to transfer medium-range missiles to Russia.